Hi, I'm Bella. My favorite book series is The Hunger Games, and I am currently rereading all of the books and sharing my thoughts here on YouTube. I finished book one in the series, The Hunger Games, and chatted about all my thoughts on that already. So now it is time for book two, Catching Fire. Like in my video for book one, my plan is to read each section of this book and then pause and give you my thoughts. So like I'll read part one, pause, record my thoughts, then read part two. So I'll share my thoughts on each part, and then at the very end, I'll share my thoughts on the book as a whole. Like with my first video, I am not planning to give you like a full summary of the entire book. Instead, I'll give you my thoughts on like themes that are popping up in the book, or like interesting moments, or just like things that stuck out to me. But I noticed in my video for book one that in order to do that, I was often like telling you some of the plot to give context to the points I was making. So I will definitely be doing that again in this video. So expect a good amount of plot. Also, I'm like going to deep dive into this book, so expect spoilers, full spoilers for the whole book. Yeah. Anyways, I am super excited to talk about this book, so let's get going. Catching Fire. I once again took a lot of notes, so let's talk about part one. Okay, so part one of Catching Fire is called The Spark. And if you hear any weird noises in the background, it's my cats. That's just a blanket statement. If you ever hear weird noises, it's my cats. So book two, Catching Fire, picks up a few months after Peeta and Katniss have gotten home from the Hunger Games, which they won. The book starts the morning that Peeta and Katniss have to leave for the Victory Tour. And it's mentioned in the book that the Victory Tour is like the halfway point between each Hunger Games. So like there's minimal time when people aren't thinking about the Hunger Games, which is kind of rough. But yeah, so it's like the halfway point between the previous Hunger Games, which Peeta and Katniss won, and the next Hunger Games. So we pick up the morning that Peeta and Katniss have to leave for the Victory Tour, and part one goes all the way to the moment where Katniss goes out for like a winter hike in the woods, and she goes all the way to the lake and is surprised by a stranger in a peacekeeper outfit with a gun, who then puts their gun down and reveals this like cookie cracker thing that has the Mockingjay symbol on it. So we have like a little bit of a cliffhanger part one ending. But yeah, part one. So part one of Catching Fire, we get to see District 12 again. And I think it's a lot of like what happens to Peeta and Katniss's lives after they come home as victors, having won the Hunger Games. And I think it's super interesting because like they are like District 12 is the same. Like everyone that they know and love is still there, and everything is like, you know, as it always was. But Peeta and Katniss are so deeply changed from the Hunger Games. So it's kind of this like interesting, and not just Peeta and Katniss, it's like their whole families and loved ones. Like it's interesting seeing them go back to a life that is totally different from the life that they left, even though they do get to come home. So we see a lot of that in part one. I have a couple of like general thoughts and themes that I wanted to talk about. So yeah. The first thing that I wanted to talk about is this theme of Katniss and how much control she has or doesn't have over like herself, her body, her relationships, her family, and this like impending rebellion or uprising. This is not like a theme that is new to Catching Fire. It's definitely something that was like set up already in book one in the Hunger Games, this idea of like Katniss sort of being a pawn and being not in control of her life. But I think what's interesting in Catching Fire is that that's explored not just in like the plot, but also in Katniss's thoughts. Like Katniss starts to think a little bit more about how like she is not in control of herself in some ways. So in particular, she thinks about it like at the beginning when Peeta and Katniss are getting ready to go on to like to leave for the victory tour. Katniss has to go through all of this like prep where they like wax her legs and like cut her hair, and I guess not cut her hair. They kind of like her hair long, but like they do all of this stuff to her, and like she doesn't get a say in it. And there's a conversation with the prep team where the prep team is sort of like talking about how they are sad that Cinna prevented them from doing any like plastic surgery on Katniss, and they say something like, well, once you're 18, he'll have to let us. And like it's moments like that where we as the reader, but I think also Katniss in, you know, as the character, is we're forced to think about how little control Katniss has over herself now that she is like part of this big system. Like she won the games, she gets to live, but she's not out. She's a victor now, and that's like essentially property of the Capitol. There's also a really tough moment where Katniss has a conversation with Haymitch, where I think Katniss's lack of control over her relationships are really highlighted. And I guess it's not even just one conversation with Haymitch, it's like the whole victory tour, but there are some really good conversations that highlight this, where Katniss on the victory tour, Katniss is forced to be like 100% in with the relationship with Peeta again. And like she has no idea how she feels about Peeta. She doesn't know how she feels about Gale. And it's really challenging for her to explore those feelings. But basically, like, Haymitch tells her, like, too bad, you have to be with Peeta. The quote from the book is, you will never ever be able to do anything but live happily ever after with that boy. And it's like it's just another instance of like, it doesn't actually matter who she likes or what she feels. She has to be in this relationship because of what happened in the games, what the Capitol expects, and their control over her. And like, she knows she has to play along because there's a part in like the beginning of the book where President Snow visits Katniss and like threatens her and her whole family and all of her loved ones. And he even says like it would be easy for me to have Gale killed. Like she has to. Anyways, she doesn't have control over her body. She doesn't have control over her relationships. She doesn't have control over her family. And what I mean by that is the Capitol, like we find out in this book, or I guess I think we might have found out at the very end of the Hunger Games, but I'm not sure. But either way, we know now that Gale, the Capitol has presented Gale as her cousin because knowing that like Gale and Katniss had a really close relationship and they're not related would have seemed weird while also playing up this big romance with Peeta. And so like that's another thing she doesn't have control over. Like there's a point in Catching Fire in the beginning where she talks about how even though people in District 12 know that Katniss and Gale aren't related, like some people almost forget that they're not related. So that's like an interesting thing that she doesn't have control over. And then also, I think the big one is this impending rebellion. And we see that a lot during the victory tour, where, so before they go on the victory tour, President Snow is like, you need to like convince everyone in the district that you are not inciting a rebellion, that you are literally just a silly girl who's in love with a boy. And then Katniss like fails at that. And I think it's like, we're sort of seeing that. I mean, it's interesting because on the one hand, we don't really know at this point, we don't know what Katniss wants to do. Like on the victory tour, Katniss is not necessarily like, yeah, I'm going to incite a rebellion. But I don't know that she's doing like the best job at convincing everyone that she's not going to incite a rebellion. I don't know. Like, I think her thoughts and feelings are like kind of up in the air, which is fine. Anyways, on the victory tour in District 11, when we get back to District 12 and Katniss sees the like news about what's going on in District 11, I think like ultimately we're seeing that like at this point, it doesn't really matter what Katniss does. She can't control this rebellion. Like it is beyond her. It is out of her control. But she is like held responsible for it by the Capitol. And it's just another interesting thing of like the Capitol and President Snow is like, this is your responsibility to like control this and to like diminish this spark that you've started. But everything that we're seeing is like, it's too late. It's going. Anyways, it's just an interesting, I think, like, particularly in this part of the book, we're seeing so much about Katniss and her relationship with control and how little control she has. That was a ramble, but I hope that made sense. Quick correction. I think I said that Katniss finds out about like unrest in District 11 when she's home in District 12. What really happens is that Katniss is home in District 12. She's in the mayor's house and she hears a like news report, but it is about an uprising in District 8. Okay. The next major theme in part 1 to talk about is the uprising and like the upcoming potential war, or at least uprising in Panem. The major things that we see related to that in part 1 are that, one, we found out that there is an open uprising in District 8. Also, there are grain shortages. This is like a brief mention in chapter 9, which is the end of part 1, that like District 12, the like tesserae grain is not like, there's not enough for people. So even though people have signed up for tessera, they're not getting it. And like the parcel day packages full of food are arriving spoiled, or like they're not getting as much. So I think that like, we don't know exactly which district is responsible for what. I think District 11 provides grain, I'm pretty sure, but I don't know if they provide all the food. But at least District 11 probably, and maybe others, are like, there's uprisings that are changing the like ability to distribute food and things like that. There's also like with the uprising District 8, I don't remember where, but I'm pretty sure when we learn about the uprising in District 8, we also learned that like the textile like factories have shut down, maybe. But like, we know that districts are uprising and like halting production and supplies that they provide to other districts, but also most importantly to the capital. So that's big. I think we're only just like at the beginning of learning about the uprising in Panem, but like it's happening. We're seeing it happen. And then also District 12 at the end of part 1 has a really big overhaul towards a more like policed state, I guess. So District 12 gets a new head peacekeeper that is like much tougher. I forgot to write down his name, but I'm pretty sure it's Romulus Thread. Is that right? Anyways, he's like really tough. He brings back like public whippings and stockades and stuff like that. And also we find out that there are just like more peacekeepers. Like there are peacekeepers on like sniper stands. I forgot what the language was about that, but there are more peacekeepers in District 12. And also the peacekeepers burn down the Hob, which is the black market in District 12. So like, I think this is related to the uprising, but I think it's also like a punishment for Katniss. But it's interesting because like District 12 hasn't really had an uprising yet. Like other than Katniss, District 12 is not really pushing back against the Capitol yet. But District 12 is being treated as though there either is or will be an uprising, which I think is interesting. Okay, and then the last like general thought theme that I wanted to talk about is, here's what I wrote: is Peeta in the game? Question mark. And what I mean by this is like in book 1, I think I talked about or thought about a lot the difference between how like in the game Katniss is and Haymitch is versus Peeta, who remains like, I think Peeta remains a little bit removed from some of the most awful parts of the Hunger Games and this like game that everyone is playing. But I think in this book, we're seeing that that's not really true. Like Peeta is in the game. Peeta is hardened from having been in the Hunger Games, and he's like really impacted and changed. Some of the like moments that I wanted to point out about this, or some of the moments that I think highlight this, are that when they're on the victory tour and Peeta offers part of like their winnings to the families of Thresh and Rue, and that causes like a big mess, and someone is executed, and Peeta and Katniss see it. That's a big mess. And Peeta recognizes that he was like missing information, and he asks Katniss and Haymitch to like let him in the loop on the little game that they play and like actually give him information. And I think like Peeta knows, like, regardless of what everyone thinks, like he's in it too. Like he's in the games too. Also, a moment that I did not notice in previous reads and rereads of this book, because I've read it multiple times, is that Peeta, like, out loud has a pretty rebellious thought that he, like, says to Katniss while they're in the Capitol. It happens on page 81 in my book. It's in chapter 5. And it's when Katniss and Peeta are in the Capitol and they're at the like president's mansion, I think, for a party. There's like that big party, and they like the prep team tells them about the drink that they can drink to make themselves throw up so that they can eat more, and both Katniss and Peeta are like pretty horrified by that, which is very reasonable. And they talk about how like it's wild that in the capital they're doing this while people in the districts literally starve to death. And like, okay, Katniss says, Peeta, they bring us here to fight to the death for their entertainment. Really, this is nothing by comparison. And then Peeta says, I know, it's just sometimes I can't stand it anymore, to the point where I'm not sure what I'll do. And then he says, maybe we were wrong, Katniss. And Katniss says, about what? And he says, about trying to subdue things in the districts. And like, I think that this has passed me by before, but Peeta literally in that moment is saying like, maybe we should start a rebellion. Maybe we should like push an uprising. And I don't know, like, it's just like a small passing conversation comment. But I don't know, like it feels surprising to me that I think Peeta is Peeta is the less rebellious one. He's like more peaceful and level-headed in all of this, but like he sees it pretty early on in this story. Like, this is maybe an uprising is what we need. Like maybe we do, I don't know, maybe we do need to change our situation. Like it's just, I don't know, that comment really stuck out to me. I was sort of surprised by it. The last like example of this that I want to talk about that I think shows that Peeta is more like hardened and tough from the games than maybe I gave him credit for previously or realized, is that when Katniss and Peeta arrive at the square to find Gale being whipped by the new head peacekeeper, which that scene is always really tough for me. Peeta, first of all, he seems to know what's going on before Katniss does, which I think is interesting. Like, it almost, the way that I read it, it almost seems like he recognizes the noise of the whip before Katniss does. I don't know. It's just, but he has this like moment of sort of like taking charge, figuring out what's going on, and then when he sees Gale, he's very firm and tries to get Katniss to leave, which she doesn't. And then also he like steps up to defend Katniss when Katniss steps in. And I don't know, like he like stands up to a peacekeeper. And that feels like a pretty big thing for someone to do. Like, that's not something that a weak person would do in this story, I think. I just think he's tough. And it's not that I thought he wasn't tough, but I think like in my mind, and I infer, like I feel like in Katniss's mind, we see Peeta as being like removed, as like a little bit, we keep him safe and separate from some of the worst horrors of the games, but like he was there too. Like, it affected him too. Anyways, I just think that's interesting. Last things, I had some like notable moments that I just wanted to point out that I thought were interesting. One, there is a moment early on in the book where Katniss talks about Parcel Day, which is the day when the like District 12's winnings for Katniss and Peeta winning the games arrive, and they get like food and like treats and mostly food. And she talks about how it's like one of the few times that she actually feels happy she won the games. And I think that's interesting. Like, I think it's just interesting to see how much Katniss, like, she really just wants to protect the people around her. Yeah, I don't know. That moment stuck out to me. And then also, there's a moment later on in part one where we learn a little bit more about the Mockingjay pin. The Mockingjay pin that Katniss wore in the arena as her token, her district token, that has now become like a big symbol. It was given to her by Madge, who is District 12's mayor's daughter and Katniss's like only friend beyond Gale. And Madge like gave it to Katniss just because, like, as a kindness in book one. But we didn't really know a whole lot about the pin other than that, like, it's a Mockingjay, which Mockingjay in general is sort of a slap in the face of the capital symbol, but like, we didn't know about the pin. Anyways, in chapter 7, we learn a little bit more about the pin, and Madge says that the pin used to be her aunt's, and that it's been in her family for a while. And we don't learn more than that right now, but I think that's interesting. That's cool information. I cried 3 times while reading part 1. I am a sap, and this book makes me cry so much. First, I cried in chapter 4 when Katniss was talking about Rue, and she says everything beautiful brings her to mind. And she also talks about how, like, her sister Prim reminds her of Rue. That made me cry, yeah. And then next in chapter 5, I cried 2 times. The first time that I cried was when Peeta, Katniss, and Haymitch are talking about how Haymitch picked one of the 2 of them, of Peeta and Katniss, to try to have live. And Haymitch says, or Peeta says, you had to choose one of us, and I'd have wanted it to be her. And then Haymitch says to Katniss how the reason that he chose Katniss was that, like, Peeta wanted to protect Katniss, and so between the 3 of us, we might be able to bring you home. And yeah, that part got me really good. Like, it's just such a tough situation for all of them. And then the third time that I cried was later on in that chapter when Katniss suggests the public marriage proposal, because, like, Katniss and Peeta have to be together, like we talked about. It's out of their control, basically. And Peeta gets upset, and Katniss is like, isn't this what he wanted? And Haymitch says, not like this. He wanted it to be real. And that part gets me good. Like, there's so much to be interested in these books. And, like, I think the romance is interesting, but I don't even think, like, I don't know. I'm not that much of a sap, but it is true that the romance in this book makes me cry. So anyways, I cried 3 times. That's all my thoughts for part 1. I will see you for part 2. Okay, Catching Fire, part 2, The Quell. I took lots of notes again. So part 2 of this book picks up where we left off in part 1, obviously, which is Katniss at the lake meeting, in part 1, we know of 1, but there's actually 2 strangers that are, like, in Peacekeeper uniforms that she runs into at the lake, and ends with Katniss, like, rising up on the pedestal, entering the arena for the 75th Hunger Games. So we go from, like, in District 12, meeting, like, which, like, also, when we leave off in part 1, we don't know that Katniss is going to be in the next Hunger Games, so it's kind of a lot that happens in part 2. But yeah, we go from, like, District 12, things are rough. The night, like, later, Katniss gets home and hears the announcement about the 75th Hunger Games, which is the quarter quell, and that's when she finds out she's going into the Hunger Games. A lot happens. Anyways, I have a couple of thoughts to discuss. The first, like, thought or theme in part 2 that I wanted to talk about is district unity. And I really think that this is the first time, or at least the most significant time in the Hunger Games in book 1 or 2, that we've seen any amount of district unity. So I think some of the, like, main examples of this are, 1, Katniss meets people from another district in or around District 12, like, not at some event. So the very beginning of part 2, Katniss meets these two runaways from District 8. That's who she runs into in the woods, and she finds out that they're runaways, which is wild. And then also they discuss like the happenings in District 8, which is currently undergoing an uprising. So Katniss finds out about like how bad things are in District 8, about how District 8 sort of like the citizens tried to overthrow District 8, and then the Capitol brought in like a bunch of peacekeepers, subdued things, and then there was a massive factory explosion that killed a ton of people. So that's all information that like would not be available to Katniss or anyone in any of the other districts, but she finds out from running into them. And I don't know if that's necessarily an example of district unity, but like she's finding out about other districts, which is huge. And then I think the biggest like moments of district unity are the entire everything leading up to the next Hunger Games. So from the moment that Katniss arrives in the Capitol, basically there's a totally different sense for how all of the victors, well, tributes who are also victors, are interacting this year compared to like previous years or what's expected. So the night of the like chariot rides, all of the victors are like chatting with one another, which is not what happened, like not Katniss's experience from the previous Hunger Games, and also just like probably not encouraged. All of the tributes that are going into the arena know each other and are friends because they've seen each other every year for the Hunger Games. They've been mentors, like they know each other. There's also moments in training where like a lot of the victors are trying to get to know one another and decide who they want to be allies with and how people are going to team up. And that's not necessarily new because we know that the careers sort of like form a pack every year, but I think this is definitely different because it's like victors from all different there are victors from districts like 1 and 2 and 4, which I think are the like typical career districts that are interacting with Katniss from District 12, which is definitely not typical. Also, we have that cool moment in training where Katniss is talking to Wyrus and Beetee, and first they tell her about the force field, which is a really interesting moment. I guess that happens second, but first they talk about like basically what is happening in their districts and what shortages there are. And again, that's like information that wouldn't ordinarily be available to people across districts. So that's interesting. And then I think the biggest moment, of course, of district unity is the night of the interviews, where all of the tributes are the way that they're doing their interview is not about like, here's why I'm gonna win. It's like, why is the Capitol doing this? And they're sort of united in this goal to try to like stop the games. And that's like an interesting thing that happens. And then of course, like the very, very end of the interview where Peeta drops the bomb announcement of Katniss being pregnant, and all of the like then at the end of that, all of the victors join hands, and it's this like Katniss, like in the book, it's described as like all like 24 victors in a row holding hands. And I think specifically the quote in the book is, it's the first public show of unity among the districts since the Dark Days. So like that's a huge moment. So there's a lot of like, and I think it's also interesting because like this Hunger Games, like this quarter quell, I think as the reader, we're led to believe that the whole purpose of it being, you know, the tributes are already victors, or the tributes are reaped from the existing victors. That's like to punish Katniss. But also like President Snow wants to punish Katniss because he wants to stop this uprising. And I think because of how much like district unity we're seeing, like I don't like, I think this is backfiring, which is interesting to see. Like, I think I hadn't noticed before just how much like people across districts are really uniting in part 2 of this book. Anyways, that brings me to the next like thought or theme that I wanted to talk about in this part of the book, which is Capitol unrest. And I think this is very much related to the thing that I just said about like, you know, the quarter quell sort of backfiring. And it's not like, so that's one part of it. But the other part of it, so there are two parts of this that I want to say. So one, the capital citizens are not having a great time because for maybe the first time, or at least for the first time in probably about 75 years, capital citizens are experiencing like shortages and want. So we hear a lot through Katniss talking to the prep team, and also just like general conversations, that because of the uprisings in the districts, capital citizens are experiencing shortages. So there's a specific mention of the prep team mentions like not being able to get any seafood for a couple of weeks, and they think that it's because of poor weather in District 4. But like we're Katniss is assuming that it's probably because of some uprising. And there's also mention of like not being able to get electronic devices. So like we're seeing the capital citizens being impacted by the district uprisings. My cat is playing with a paper bag. So if you hear that, that's what that is. Sorry. The other aspect of capital unrest that I wanted to talk about is that the capital citizens do not seem very happy with the direction that this year's Hunger Games is going, at least right now, before the games have started. So we have like a couple different examples of this. One, when Peeta and Katniss are on the train going back to the capital for the games, there's like a train attendant that Peeta points out like seems like they feel bad for Peeta and Katniss. And it seems like Peeta like thinks or intuits or knows that capital citizens are not going to be very thrilled to have to like say goodbye to people that they already know. Also, Katniss's prep team literally cannot hold it together, and they are like crying on her while trying to get her ready for all of the different events and for the games. And I think like that is probably a little bit different for them specifically because, you know, they're more attached to Katniss than the average capital citizen would be. Also, Katniss talks about how she's sort of their ticket to fame and everything. And so not only are they saying goodbye to her, they're saying goodbye to like the fame that they've had. But I still think that they're like I think it's not just them. I think that also other capital citizens are sad to be saying goodbye. And then I think the biggest moment of seeing some like capital dissatisfaction about the games is the night of the interviews, where like particularly at the very end of the interviews where Peeta reveals that Katniss is pregnant, like they have to stop the show because, and it's not because of the victors, like they're all calm on the stage, they're not doing anything, but they're like words and the fact that they are like many of them are going to die and the Capitol knows them, that gets the Capitol audience so upset that Katniss describes it as like almost a mob scene. I just think that, you know, it's interesting. Like, I think particularly, again, going back to, I'm pretty sure that this quarter quell was set up as a way to subdue the districts and punish Katniss. And so far, I don't think that's working. So yeah, that's interesting. The last like thought that I wanted to talk about, and this is a sappy thought, is the note that I wrote is the love real? And I think that all I want to point out is that in part 2 of this book, I think we're getting more moments of Peeta and Katniss that feel more genuine. And there's a moment that really stuck out to me. And it's the, like, I think it's like the last night. I don't know if it's, I can't remember if it's a night on the train or like in the training center, but there's some night where they sleep together and they both talk about how like, oh wow, for the first time in a while, I haven't had any nightmares. And I just think it's significant that they never have nightmares, or they have more instances of not having nightmares when they sleep in the same bed. I just think that that's worth pointing out. Okay. And also, like, Katniss is not a very happy person. Like, she does not have a lot of happiness, and I think that there are very few people that make her happy and instances where she is happy. But like the day before the games, when Katniss and Peeta have their little picnic date on the roof, Katniss, like, she seems super happy. And given everything, like, I just think it's significant that Peeta can make her happy, even amidst everything. Another point for Katniss and Peeta's love being more real is that Katniss lets Peeta help her with the family book, which she describes as this like book that different members of her family have added to about like plants. So there's like apothecary adjacent plants from like a previous generation of her family, and then her father added edible plants. And now she is adding information with Peeta's help. And Katniss is not a trusting person. She's not a very open person. I think that's significant. So, anyways, I know a lot of their love is for show, and I know that Katniss, at least at this stage, has no idea how she feels, but I think we're seeing more instances of it seeming more real, which is notable. Anyways, okay, those are the like themes that I wanted to point out. The other thing that I wanted to talk about were two moments of like interesting people slash information that I wanted to bring up, and actually they're both related. So, are not related, but it's anyways. Okay, just bear with me. So first of all, there is a section in part 2 where we get to hear a ton about Haymitch's games. And so we learn like what the arena was like and how a lot of different people died and like what happened to Haymitch and how he won. And I'm super excited to get to compare that or to build on that in the new prequel that's coming out next month. And so I don't have like a whole lot to say about that other than I sort of forgot just how much we actually already know about Haymitch's games, and I'm really excited to learn more. So that's going to be cool. And then the other interesting thing that I wanted to point out, I think in part 1 I mentioned that we learn that Madge's Mockingjay pin that she gives to Katniss previously belonged to her aunt. And in part 2 we learn who her aunt was, and big, huge information. Her aunt was Maisie Donner, who was also a tribute that went into the Hunger Games with Haymitch. And I just think it's super cool. Like, this connection is really, I feel like it's really interesting. And I'm really excited and hopeful that we'll get to maybe learn more about Maisie Donner in this upcoming prequel. But yeah, I just really like that connection. Like the Mockingjay pin, it's such a great symbol, and Mockingjay, like it's a great symbol for Katniss, and it turns into so much in this series. But I sort of love this idea of it, like it wasn't just Katniss's. Like it's this deeper thing, and it has literally a history with another person who was affected and killed in the games. I just think it's interesting. I really like that, and I'm excited for more. Also, in addition to learning more about Maisie Donner in terms of the like Mockingjay pin, we also learned that Maisie Donner was really good friends with Katniss's mom. So I'm also wondering if we'll get to learn more about Katniss's mom in the prequel, which would be interesting. I don't know. Who knows, right? Because like she's not in the games, but just interesting. I like these connections. I think it's cool. That's all I had in terms of like points that I wanted to discuss. Anyways, I cried 1.5 times in part 2, which actually felt like way fewer cries than I expected. I almost cried at the moment where Katniss is drunk, I think. No. Yeah, Katniss Katniss is injured and has her mom gives her some like sleep syrup stuff, and she's falling asleep, and she like asks, basically like Peeta puts her to bed, and then she asks Peeta to stay with her and doesn't hear his response. But like we know his response. If you've read the books already or seen the movie, you know his response. And that almost made me cry, but I didn't. I held it together. But then later, when Katniss and Peeta have to leave again for the next Hunger Games, and unexpectedly they don't get to say goodbye to their families, I really cried there. That moment really got me. Anyways, those are my 2 cries. And I think that's everything. Once again, I feel like I have rambled incoherently, but hopefully this mostly made sense. Part 2, like a lot happened, but also it's another like massive cliffhanger, and the games part of this book is like maybe my favorite part of the book. So I'm really, really excited to start part 3. So yeah, see you for part 3. Part 3 is called The Enemy, and we pick up at the very beginning of the 75th Hunger Games. So part 2 ends with Katniss like rising up out of the tube into the arena, looking around, and then that's it. Like that's the end of part 2. So part 3 picks up right after that and then just starts the Hunger Games. And we end at the end of the Hunger Games with Katniss and others in a hovercraft on the way to District 13. So quite an ending. Yeah, so this section or this part of the book is super action packed because we have an entire Hunger Games like in just one section of the book. Yeah, there's a lot that goes on. Okay, so some thoughts or themes that I wanted to talk about part 3. The first one that I wanted to talk about is the strategy to save Peeta. So Katniss enters these Hunger Games with the intent of like her not winning, not surviving the Hunger Games, but Peeta living and winning the games. And she makes this plan pretty clear to Haymitch, and also I think to Peeta. It's not a secret that she thinks that like because in the first Hunger Games, Haymitch was trying to keep Katniss alive, Peeta was trying to keep Katniss alive. For this Hunger Games, like they both owe it to Peeta to try to keep him alive. And I think also like Katniss sees herself as a bad person who has like done bad things to survive, but like still, whereas Peeta is still like a good person and, you know, is the one who deserves to live. So Katniss's goal is to keep Peeta alive. And she makes a deal with Haymitch to keep Peeta alive as well. And I think like she thinks that Haymitch is sticking to that deal. I think by the end of the book, we don't really think that specifically, but the interesting thing is that throughout all of part 3, we see not just Katniss, but all of the victors trying to keep Peeta alive. And throughout part 3, it's not super clear why, at least like to Katniss, it's definitely not super clear why. I think there's a moment where she thinks maybe all of the victors think that he is worth keeping alive because like he's really well spoken and he, you know, could be a positive voice for change, or they think he's a good person like she does, but she doesn't really know what the deal is. But at the very end, we find out that the reason that everyone was trying to keep Peeta alive is that they know that if he's dead, they have no chance of using Katniss as like the Mockingjay. So interesting. But yeah, there are some very interesting like moments that we really see this strategy come into play. The first one is when Finnick resuscitates Peeta after he like hits the force field and is like dead, like his heart stops. And I think the reason that moment is interesting is that like if we were all truly acting as tributes in these games, like someone is dead, like you shouldn't try to save them. So that goes totally against the way that a tribute would act in these games for Finnick to not just to like help someone, but to literally reverse death, like stop him he's already dead, like it could be over, but he resuscitates him. So that's, I think, a huge act. And also Finnick doing that, I think he's putting himself in danger because like he's exerting himself, like that takes energy that he could be using to, you know, travel, to eat, to like find food, to take care of himself. And I think he puts himself in danger because Katniss does not understand what's going on. And like Katniss almost shoots Finnick until she remembers or like figures out that he's helping Peeta. So that's a huge moment. We also see Mags sacrifice herself, I would say, for Peeta. When Finnick, Peeta, Katniss, and Mags are traveling through the like poison fog that starts to affect their like nerves, Finnick has to carry someone, and like Finnick is carrying Mags, but then Peeta needs to be carried. There's this whole thing where like Finnick has to choose between carrying Peeta or Mags, and Mags just like kisses My cats are here to play. instead of having them make this decision or like figuring out how, because it's like an impossible situation, like someone, it's not going to work to carry everyone. Mags kisses Finnick and walks into the fog and dies, and like that's specifically to save PETA. We also see one of the morphlings sacrifice themselves with the monkeys. There's a monkey that's about to attack PETA, and the morphling like jumps out of nowhere and dies. And then also the time after the like arena is spun, so they're not sure which, like where on the clock they are. The group intends to go into like a section of forest that they're not sure what it is. And like, I think Joanna and others basically speak up to have PETA stay on the beach while Katniss and Finnick go into the forest where there's like potentially a threat. And it ends up being the section of forest with the Jabberjays. But I think Katniss points out like it's interesting that they're specifically like, it's not what everyone says. Like they're sort of like, no, just have Katniss go into the woods. It's fine. But it seems to her that they don't want PETA to risk going into the woods where he could be hurt. But yeah, I just think it's interesting seeing all of these moments. And I think particularly rereading this book, it's very obvious how many moments there are of people like, you know, sacrificing themselves and going out of their way to protect PETA. And it's particularly interesting rereading it, knowing what winds up being the motive, which is just like for Katniss, essentially. Another theme that I noticed a lot in this part is the in-game camaraderie or like fun that happens in the arena. And there are like a couple of small moments of this where they like congratulate one another for like figuring out how to like cook the meat with the force field and like all these little moments. But there's like a moment where after the fog attack, they get into the water to like wash out their skin from the poison fog, and Finnick like comes back to life and is doing all of these like doing all of this swimming in the water. That's, I don't know, it's just like joyous and fun. And then also there's the really, I think, sweet moment where they all get the like itch cream, whatever, to help with their itchy and scabby skin after the fog. And it makes them look ugly. And like Katniss is teasing Finnick about how it's his first time ever looking ugly, and then Finnick and Katniss like scare PETA with their ugly faces, I guess. I don't know. I think that moment is really funny and cute, and like it's so tough because we have to see that moment in the context of like the Hunger Games where everyone is literally fighting to the death. But it's also just like, I don't know, like these are just people that could be friends and could be happy. And I don't know, it's interesting seeing those moments, and it's also really tough. And then the last thought that I had a lot in this part is lies. There are a lot of lies and a lot of people who are doing lies. A lot of lying is happening in part 3. One, I mean, I think like Haymitch is lying to Katniss, I think beyond just part 3, but we really learn in part 3 that he's been lying to Katniss this whole entire book. But also the other tributes are lying to Katniss. So in part 3, we get like an overview kind of the rebel plan, and we learn that some districts, like some district tributes knew some amount of the plan going into the Hunger Games. The tributes from districts 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, and 11 had like varying degrees of knowledge. So that is Beady and Wyrus, Finnick and Mags, both of the Morphlings, Blight and Joanna, and Chaff and Cedar. And I feel like I'm missing someone. There are 2 names that I forgot to write down in this list, so I will put them in later.
Hi, this is Bella from editing, and the 2 that I forgot are Woof and Cecilia.
But there's a lot of folks that like did have knowledge going into the games. And what I think is particularly interesting is like, we don't necessarily know exactly how much knowledge they had. So what I'm curious about is there's this like big reveal moment where Katniss figures out that the arena is a clock, and she tells everyone, and I think in the book, we kind of skip over that moment really quickly. Like we don't really know exactly what the reactions are of the other tributes. It just sort of says that like Katniss does convince them. But my thought or question is like, wouldn't they already know that the arena is a clock? I don't know. Like, anyways, I'm wondering if they knew that there's these like, we get tons of instances of the tributes getting packages of bread, and we find out later that the bread is significant in that like the the district where the bread is from indicates what day of the games the like rescue will happen, and the number of loaves of bread indicates the hour. And like they if they knew that, wouldn't they also know that it's a clock? You know? Anyways, it's just like Finnick was definitely in on things. Beatty was definitely in on things, and like those two in particular gain Katniss's trust, and they're lying to her. And I don't know. There's like, anyways, there's a lot of lies in this part from people that Katniss is like not one to trust easily. So it's definitely challenging and really interesting to see those lies starting to happen. Anyways, beyond that, I had some other like little notes that I wanted to mention about part 3. One, it's interesting seeing the Capitol use birds as a weapon after the Mockingjay has been sort of used as a symbol of the rebellion and hope. So the Capitol puts Jabberjays in one of the sections of the clock, and they torment Finnick and Katniss. It was just interesting to see that. Also, once again, we're seeing the force field used as a tool. Both the tributes both use the force field to like cook their food, and also the very ending they use a weakness of the force field to break out of the games. So that's interesting. And also, the last thing, and this is related to my comment about all of the lies in this part. It's really challenging to see the betrayal of Haymitch. Like Haymitch betraying Katniss is really, really tough. And there's a part at the end where Katniss says, "At least in the Hunger Games, I knew I was being played with." And boy, howdy. I feel like that line is like the crux of how I feel about this trilogy and like Katniss's place in this trilogy. That like it's so tough because she's being played with both by the Capitol and by people that she trusts, and like that's really challenging. Anyways, yeah, that part is really tough. I cried 2 additional times in part 3 of this book. The first time that I cried in part 3 was I think, very sad and touching moment where in the games, Peeta pulls out his locket and he has a picture of Katniss's family, like one picture of Katniss's mom and sister Prim and one picture of Gale. And he has this whole spiel of like, your family needs you, you have to go home, like you're the one that has to survive. And then also the moment where Peeta is like, there's no one back home that needs me. And Katniss has this moment of realization, like, actually, I need you. Like, I wouldn't be okay going home without you. That moment gets me. I know that it's like a lovey moment. It just, I don't know. It gets me. It's really sad. It's really hard. And I think that the way that that scene is written, also with like the way that they end that scene by, like, you can tell that Peeta's being sincere and genuine because he's not mentioning like the fake pregnancy and all this stuff. And then when he brings it up, you can tell that that kind of like, I think Katniss describes it as our break from the games is over or something like that. I just think that it's like such a touching scene and it's really hard. And then the second time that I cried is at the very, very end. So when Katniss is like in the hovercraft, learns about the rebel plan, finds out everything that's happening, and also finds out that Peeta was taken by the Capitol, so Peeta is not with them going to District 13, and Finnick apologizes to Katniss. Finnick is like, Katniss, I'm so sorry that I didn't go back. That part made me cry. That part, I think, made me cry the hardest out of the whole book. I don't know specifically why, but boy, howdy, that part made me cry. Anyways, that brings me to 6 total cries this book, which is not as bad as I thought. I feel like that's a pretty respectable amount. But yeah, that is part 3. I'll be back in just a moment for my thoughts on the whole entire book. Let's talk about Catching Fire, Book 2 in the Hunger Games series, in its entirety. This book is actually my favorite book in the series, or at least in the original trilogy. I think, like, one, we get so much information revealed to us about what is going on in the world, and I love that. I love world building, and I love learning about, like, different perspectives and different plots and all that stuff that's going on. Like, we get to learn we get to learn about District 13. We get to learn about, like, this rebel plot that has been going on. Like, we get to learn a lot, which is super fun. Also, the 75th Hunger Games, I think, are just so interesting and cool. I think the arena is a really interesting and cool design. I love learning about that. I think it's really interesting to see how, like, the first Hunger Games book, the games in that book are very, like, they're pretty solitary. Like, for a lot of those games, Katniss is alone, and then when she's not alone, we get, like, a brief amount of time of Katniss and Rue, and then a brief amount of time of Katniss and Peeta. But it's like pretty solitary, which I think is fun and interesting. But it's really cool to see Katniss and Peeta and the other victors, or I mean tributes, victors who are now tributes, work together in these Hunger Games. I just think the dynamic that we get to see is super, super interesting. So yeah, I like this book a lot. I think it's really neat. Also, it has some, like, really incredible emotional moments, which are challenging but really interesting. Also, the ending of this book I think is phenomenal. We end on the, like, there is no District 12 line, which is such an incredible and heartbreaking ending to a book. Suzanne Collins, you're a star. It's just, like, really, really dramatic. And it's, like, a really great setup for the final book. Like, finishing the first book, I was definitely excited to read the second book because I love these books and I love that book. But I think finishing the second book, it's like, oh my God, I can't wait another hour. I have to start reading the third book immediately, which is an exciting way to, like, feel in a series. Anyways, I have some, like, whole book thoughts to mention, and then I'm going to wrap this thing up. First of all, Katniss. I think it's really interesting to see Katniss go through this book, and it's really interesting to see, you know, her continued transformation and her state of mind and everything. Like, I think it's particularly interesting to see her relationship to trust almost. Like, I think Katniss trusts Peeta a lot. And also Katniss starts to trust the other tributes, like, way easier or way quicker than we might have expected previously. And I think that's a lot because of, like, Haymitch and Peeta and all this stuff, but I think that's interesting to see from her. We also see a lot more. I think this is a theme in, like, all of the books, but we continue to explore this idea of, like, what of her life is Katniss in control over. So, you know, once again, Katniss is forced into the Hunger Games out of her control. And she's also forced into alliances with other tributes kind of out of her control. And then ultimately she is forced into this rebel plot out of her control. And there are all these things that are happening to her outside of her control. And that's just really interesting to see. Also, we have a massive betrayal this book, and I think there's kind of two betrayals, but one is expected and one isn't. The first betrayal is when Katniss is sort of, like, almost like betrayed by the Capitol, in that she is forced to go back into the Hunger Games after already winning and being a victor. And, you know, victors are supposed to be, like, good for life. They're done, they're good, they're safe, they don't have to work, but they're forced back into the games. And I think, like, it's a betrayal just because it's sort of like one thing was guaranteed to her and then it's taken away, but it's not really surprising because it's coming from the Capitol. But the second betrayal, which I think is from Haymitch, where Katniss is part of this rebel plot without her knowledge or consent, is a really tough betrayal. Yeah. And at the very, very end, when the, like, plot is explained, they say that Katniss and Peeta weren't told anything about it because they knew that they would be targets for capture by the Capitol, and so it was better for them to not have any information that they could share. But, like, still, for someone who has such a challenging relationship with trust and with manipulation from from the Capitol, but like, it's just really tough. Also, I think it's super interesting to see her state at the very end of the games when she's like pulled out of the arena. It sort of reminds me of her state at the end of the first Hunger Games when she's pulled out of the arena and she sees herself and, sees someone who is like feral and wild. And in this book, when she sort of like wakes up and comes to, she thinks that she has been captured by the Capitol and assumes that Peeta has as well, and like goes out in search of Peeta to kill him, to sort of like save him from being captured by the Capitol. And then when she finds out the reality of the situation, she wants to die herself out of spite for like Haymitch betraying her, basically. She's just like, it's just a really rough state, which is no surprise given everything that's happened, but it's rough. She's not having a great time. Also, once again, I think a major kind of theme in this book is love, and the love between Katniss and Peeta, which I think it's hard to say exactly where it is at any moment because, we were still just in the Hunger Games. They are playing their love as an act for the cameras. But in this book, we see more moments of what seem like real, genuine connection between them. One of those moments is when Peeta hits the force field and like dies. Katniss is like totally loses it. And like, it doesn't guarantee, like, it doesn't mean that she's in love with him. It just means that she really cares about him. But I just think that's an interesting moment to capture in this book. And then also the conversation with the locket where Katniss has this, I think, like, in the moment realization that, like, she actually does need Peeta. And then also they share a kiss that she says is only the second kiss that she's ever had that made her feel something. I don't know. It's just interesting to see their love continue to, I don't know, grow. Something's happening, and that's interesting to see. And then the last, I think, thought and theme of this book is, of course, war. War is happening, or at least at the end of the book, we're like, we're at war, basically. So I think a lot of this book is, we start this book with some of the districts are approaching, getting close to uprising. So there are like some districts are kind of pushing back against the Capitol, but nothing really is happening in a major way yet. There are some instances of rebellion, but they're all subdued by the Capitol. But we find out at the very end of the book that like every district is in open rebellion with the Capitol after the end of the Hunger Games. So, like, we're at war, basically. I think, does it say every district? It's either every or, like, most. But, like, open rebellion. There's war. Also, I think so much of this book is the Capitol trying to subdue the districts. So on the victory tour, there's all of this pressure for Katniss to subdue the districts. And then going into the games, I think, or, I don't know if this is exactly, it's not like explicitly stated in the book, but I think the 75th Hunger Games are meant to be sort of like a warning to the districts, like that the Capitol does have power over them, as a way to subdue the districts. Also a way to punish Katniss, but largely a way to subdue the districts. Anyways, all of this stuff is happening with the Capitol and it's not working. Like the districts are not at all subdued during this book, and even like citizens of the Capitol are unhappy with the Capitol government. So it's very interesting to see that sort of happening. And yeah, at the end of the book, it's not looking good. Anyways, those are kind of my whole book thoughts for book 2 of The Hunger Games, Catching Fire. Thank you for reading this with me. I hope this was at least a little bit enjoyable. One book remaining in the original trilogy, and then we've got the 2 prequels to read next. So I'm going to continue reading them and taking a ton of notes and sharing my thoughts. So I hope you'll join me, but also no pressure. But anyways, thank you so much for watching. Like I've said a lot, these are my favorite books, so I really like chatting about them. So yeah, see you next time for the third book in the trilogy, Mockingjay. Bye.